Hi, everyone. Hopefully you can see me and hear me well. So a very warm good morning, good afternoon, good evening to you all, depending on where you are in the world. My name is Hannah Sweet, and I'm a climate change expert with the Initiative for Climate Action Transparency, or ICAT. I'll be your moderator for the webinar today, and I'm really pleased to welcome you all to this webinar to launch the ICAT Just Transitions Monitoring Guide. So just before we begin, a quick note on some of the practical aspects of this webinar and the platform that we're using. I think many of you would have already noticed that you are muted with your camera off. So if you do have any questions, comments, or would like to get in touch with us, you can do this through the Q&A button that you should see at the bottom of your screen. You can use this function at any time during the webinar, so you don't have to wait until we get to a Q&A session. You can write any comments or questions through that button. Also a note on interpretation. This webinar will only be available in English, so there will be no interpretation option. However, just to note that a French version of this guide is actually on its way as well. So there'll be another webinar in a few months in French when we launch that French version of this guide. In terms of our agenda for today, as you can see on your screen, we'll start with some opening words by Henning Wooster, the director of ICAT. This will be followed by an introductory presentation to the Just Transitions Monitoring Guide, where we'll go through the different steps that are included in its framework. There will then be some time for questions before we move on to hear from 3 countries who have applied the guide's framework. So firstly from Nigeria, followed by South Africa and Brazil. And there will also be some additional time for questions and discussion after this before we have the closing remarks. So without further ado, I'd like to hand over to Henning to say some opening words to start off this webinar. So over to you, Henning.
Thank you very much, Hannah, and good afternoon, good morning, or good evening, colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, wherever you are. Very pleased to welcome you also from my side to this webinar. We are at a good point because we are able to launch the new ICAT Just Transition Monitoring Guide. This guide is really an innovation, the first of its kind, a comprehensive resource dedicated to supporting countries in monitoring what is needed to ensure that the transition towards low-carbon, climate-resilient economies is and remains just. It draws on real-world experiences, in-country applications, and a robust body of literature. It offers practical guidance on setting priorities and goals, choosing relevant indicators, establishing meaningful targets, and effectively collecting and communicating data to diverse audiences. Your presence here today from across the globe demonstrates your commitment to advancing climate action in a way that is fair, inclusive, and grounded in transparency and accountability. It speaks to your determination to build frameworks that ensure that nobody is left behind in the global collective journey towards a sustainable future. We trust that this guide becomes a valuable addition to your climate action toolkit, one that you will return to often as you strengthen your country's just transition framework or strategy. We hope it sparks new conversations, fosters collaboration, and supports practical action on the ground. So you may wonder, why does ICAT, which is focused on transparency, embarks on a guide that focuses on the just transition component of climate action? So let me just take a step back and introduce ICAT to you. As many of you know, that ICAT is created and is operating to help countries build the transparency frameworks that they need to implement the Paris Agreement. And that means a transparency framework that is not only the basis for reporting on action to other countries, but also the basis for initiating, taking, and shaping action in your countries in order to achieve the objectives that you have set yourself. And those objectives encompass climate objectives, reducing emissions or building resilience, and development objectives. And this is where we are linking to the reason why we've created this guide on monitoring just transitions. As countries currently are focusing on creating their new updated nationally determined contributions, NDC 3.0 as it is sometimes referred to, they are faced with challenges in strengthening action, in embarking on more ambitious climate action in order to get closer towards the global climate objectives that the Paris Agreement has set. Here, ensuring that any transformational change which is required in order to achieve these climate objectives happens in a way that takes along everybody in the country. It leaves nobody behind, and that's where a just transition is so extremely essential. Many of you will know the ICAT series of policy assessment guides. Those are guides that help countries assess policies and actions that they want to take to implement their NDCs and climate action at large, with a view to looking at how these policies and actions impact emissions in various sectors, but also looking beyond those climate objectives and looking at how they impact sustainable development objectives, making sure that climate action is in sync with development priorities in the country. And the Just Transitions monitoring guide that we are launching here today is taking this a step further. It actually enables countries to build a framework that ensures that the action and any corrective measures taken is in line with just transition priorities and goals that they have established. It enables countries to ensure that stakeholders that might feel threatened by climate action can be taken along and will not object to climate action that is necessary from a climate perspective. Monitoring just transitions plays a very crucial role in this regard because it's the element that builds trust and accountability. It reassures those that are seeing a risk of being left behind that they are actually looked after. So establishing goals and priorities for a just transition is a first step, but then moving further into monitoring this as the climate transformation unfolds is absolutely essential to ensure legitimacy and build a momentum for change. The guide, as you will hear shortly, provides practical tools to help governments and stakeholders define justice-related goals, identify indicators, and track progress in real time. The guide draws from in-country applications, and we will hear during this webinar from some of the countries that have already worked on monitoring just transitions through ICAT-supported projects. We will hear from Nigeria, where ICAT supported the development of a just and gender inclusive transition MRV framework. This was work under the Nigerian Ministry for Labor and Employment. We'll hear from South Africa, where ICAT supported creating the Just Transition Monitoring, Evaluation and Learning Framework, which is closely aligned with the national Just Transition Framework. And we'll hear from Brazil, where work is still underway. And some of you will have seen that Brazil already submitted its NDC at the last COP and is now in the process of developing a national climate plan, the Plano Clima, and ICAT is supporting to develop in tandem with that plan the just transition component to ensure that this plan can be established in a way that safeguards all the interests that might be at risk. Just transitions and tackling climate change at large cannot happen in isolation. While implementation is local, success depends on the global solidarity and shared learning. This is why I'm so pleased that so many of you are able to join us here at this webinar. And I hope you will all benefit from the experience that you will hear from, and please engage in the discussions actively to share your own experience and the challenges that you face. Let us remember that a just transition is essential. The transition that we need to face the climate change challenge is not a luxury. It's a necessity, and it has to be just in order to be successful. So by expanding transparency to incorporate the just transition dimension, countries can build economies that are low carbon and high opportunity in a way that every person has a chance to thrive. And as you embark on your just transition efforts at home in your countries, ICAT is ready and available to support you. Thank you very much again for joining us, and we look forward to a rich and engaging discussion.
Thanks, Henning, for those opening words, and I think really highlighting the importance of transparency in this context of just transitions and the benefits of doing this, which have really driven, I think, why we developed the guide. And this sets the scene really well for the next presentation, which will give an overview of the guide itself. For this presentation, I'm really pleased to introduce two members of the team from the World Resources Institute, or WRI, who have led the development of the Just Transitions Monitoring Guide. So firstly, Neelam Singh, who's a Senior Associate of the Global Climate Program, and Chelsea Gomez, who is the Climate Transparency Project Manager. So over to you, Neelam and Chelsea.
Thank you so much, Hannah, and thank you, Henning, for those wonderful introductions. As Hannah said, my name is Chelsea Gomez. I'm with the World Resources Institute. Sorry. I'm an author on the ICAT Just Transitions Tracking Guide. And today I'm going to walk you through some of the understanding behind the guide, as well as the methodology that's presented in the ICAT Just Transitions Monitoring Guide, so that you can learn how to better apply the guide in your own context. Next slide, please. So we'll begin our presentation today by walking you through what exactly is the ICAT Just Transitions Monitoring Guide, describing who should use it and what the benefits are, And finally, we'll dive into the recommended steps from the guide. So the ICAT Just Transitions Monitoring Guide was developed by the World Resources Institute and the Initiative for Climate Action Transparency. The guide provides a methodology to support the development of a monitoring framework that will enable governments to track the status of a just transition that's defined by stakeholders. Similar to a national greenhouse gas inventory, a just transition monitoring system is a useful tool for monitoring changes in relevant indicators, but alone cannot explain what is causing them. The guide is not a policy assessment tool meant to attribute impacts to specific policies, but rather a methodology for defining and monitoring the state of a just transition in order to inform policy and practice. The guide provides guidance to monitor and analyze social, economic, and environmental changes that may occur as countries implement policies to transition to a low-carbon, climate-resilient economy. The guide provides a step-by-step approach to support the development of a monitoring framework that enables governments to track the status of a just transition and employs a distributive, procedural, and restorative justice lens to understand how these changes may be impacting different groups. So the guide was designed for government agencies and ministries, such as those responsible for development, climate planning, data management, and finance. This includes national, subnational, regional, or local jurisdictions. However, the recommendations and considerations put forward by the guide can be used by non-governmental organizations, community service organizations, or financial institutions to support government-led tracking efforts or to better engage with the just transition monitoring process. So there are numerous benefits to monitoring just transitions. The first is that it can increase accountability and transparency in climate action by transparently sharing information on decision-making processes, goals, strategies, and impacts. And this can allow stakeholders to hold decision makers accountable for their stated commitments. The second is to inform just transition and development policies. So monitoring just transition indicators can therefore inform decision-making, enhance policy coherence, and contribute to the design of future policies. Gathering data on relevant indicators can help establish credible baselines, capture trends, and provide insights on the direction of change across selected areas of interest. Just transition considerations have become more prevalent within international and national climate policy planning. They're also increasingly being included in NDCs and LT-LEDs. So consistently monitoring these changes in socioeconomic environmental indicators can therefore facilitate policy modifications. The third benefit is to facilitate access to climate finance. So by tracking just transition related indicators, countries can monitor and document their progress towards outcomes that may have been agreed upon as part of funding from domestic or international sources, such as in the case of South Africa and Indonesia's Just Energy Transition Partnership plans. So tracking can demonstrate readiness and also demonstrate a commitment towards an inclusive and equitable transition to potential investors and partners. So this next portion of our presentation will walk you through the following recommended steps. We'll begin with step 1, developing just transition related goals and priorities. Step 2, formulating targets and key social and economic indicators. Step 3, establishing data coordination and collection processes. Step 4, analyzing data. And lastly, communicating and reporting results to reflect these changes and inform policies and decisions. So step 1, as I just mentioned, will be developing goals and priorities. So developing goals and priorities, it can be just transition goals, right, can be thought of as high-level statements that indicate desired outcomes across social, economic, and environmental dimensions. They can also articulate long-term, justice-oriented, and inclusive change that should accompany the transition to address climate change. So just transition goals, they can be thought of as process-oriented or outcome-oriented, but they should describe how communities interpret their future in terms of their people and their place in society. A good test, could you click one forward? Thank you. A good test of whether a goal is a just transition goal versus a climate or any other type of goal is to check to see whether it's actually addressing one of the 3 justices, which is distributive, procedural, or restorative justice. Next slide, please. So just transition goals versus just transition priorities. So distinct from goals, priorities will represent key impact areas that should be monitored during the transition to a low carbon, climate resilient economy. So users can define their just transition priorities based on impact assessment studies, and this can be done in collaboration with stakeholders. It's important to note, though, that since impact analyses focus only on the potential negative impacts of the transition, that users are encouraged to seek additional input and engagement with stakeholders to also monitor how benefits and opportunities are being shared. So priority areas, they may include jobs in the fossil fuel sector, the availability of finance in vulnerable communities, or access to clean renewable energy. In comparison, a possible goal related to the jobs priority may be to provide support for workers who are laid off from the coal industry or related businesses to secure good quality new jobs with family sustaining incomes. Or another example would be by 2030, a country's energy sector will have net positive employment in a range of zero carbon industries. Can you click forward one? So it's important to remember that not all impacts should be considered priorities. Instead, impacts with a high likelihood of affecting communities or having a significant magnitude should then be identified as priorities. Next slide. So the key steps that are put forward in this first chapter step of the guide is to begin with preparing an inclusive process. So as I had mentioned, right, through the goals and priorities, these need to be defined with stakeholders. And so this can ensure procedural justice in the process by making sure that stakeholders are having a say in their future. A just transition should not be considered just unless we have that element. The second step would be to identify impacts. So goals or priorities, they should be informed by knowledge of current and future impacts in vulnerable communities to support distributive and restorative justice. developing goals, it can require significant political buy-in. And this may be challenging for some governments or some users of the guide who are working in jurisdictions that are in the very early stages of just transitions, and are just beginning with those public dialogues, and where the government may not adopted any kind of specific vision statement or overarching objectives for the just transition. And in those cases, users of the guide, they may consider identifying priorities based on an understanding of the impacts of the transition. The third step is to develop priorities or goals. So broadly, priorities focus on the key impacts or areas of concern for monitoring. And goals, process goals can ensure decision-making is fair, and outcome goals can prevent negative impacts and address social, economic, and environmental injustices. For the purposes of this guide, goals and priorities, they exist on a continuum of specificity. So users identifying priorities, they can choose to advance along this progression to eventually define goals if that fits their context. So whether users continue, can you go back, please? Sorry. So whether users choose to develop goals or set priorities, again, they should decide this approach either before engaging with stakeholders or in consultation with stakeholders. And this just ensures consistency throughout the process, avoids confusion, and ensures that the stakeholder input is tailored and practical. The last step, of course, is to validate these goals and priorities with stakeholders. This is in line with an inclusive process that was identified in the first step. And so it also just helps to ensure procedural justice. Okay, next slide. All right, I'm going to hand it over to Neelam Singh to walk you through the next set of steps in the guide. Thanks.
Thank you, Chelsea, and welcome everyone from my side as well. And good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are. So I will walk us through the remaining steps that Chelsea had highlighted in one of her previous slides, and now we come to look targets. So as you may have noticed, the monitoring steps are pretty similar to any kind of monitoring that one may undertake, emissions monitoring or any other kind of monitoring. The difference here really is in details as to how to apply those bigger, broader monitoring steps to just transition, a discussion of just transition in particular. Next slide, please. So in our context, targets provide benchmarks to monitor progress, to understand how the transition is unfolding. And clearly articulated goals are really important here because they can help inform the targets and subsequently the indicators. Since we are talking just transition, these targets obviously refer to formulated targets which are in line with the stated goals or priorities, and essentially they bring further detail and nuance into the picture and point to specific change that may be of interest to the users, to the governments applying the guide. So for instance, your goal may have been around, say, promoting gender equality as your clean energy sector transitions. You could when it comes to formulating related targets, you could include more specificity by introducing, for instance, the percentage increase in the number of SMEs, small, medium enterprises that you want to see within the clean energy sector, or you can include percentage of women-owned businesses that are also small and medium enterprises, or it could be a target that is specific to promoting economic diversification in a coal-dependent region and attaching some benchmarks to that particular target. So you're essentially bringing more specificity to the goals and or the priorities and thinking about how many jobs are being targeted and by when, what kind of specific social protection measures are being planned and by when. So that's the function of the targets. Next, please. So targets are definitely recommended, but we also realize that countries and users may be at different points in terms of implementing this guide and approaching the guide. So there is flexibility within the guide in several of the steps, and in this case, users can choose to set them over time based on data and resources, and they can, if they choose to set these targets later in their journey in monitoring just transition, they can start with monitoring the indicators, and then subsequently, as more data gets collected, there's more confidence in setting benchmarks associated with the targets, and key indicators are emerging that they want to monitor progress towards those benchmarks. They can then subsequently develop the targets. Next, please. Users could have multiple targets contributing to a single goal in general, but in the real world, capacity is a constraint, resource is a constraint. So at least aim for one target per goal so that you are able to have some benchmarks to determine how you're faring against the goal. But the number of targets really very much depends on the capacity and resources, and it's really a progression. As time passes, you can add more targets or just begin with indicators. So essentially, the guide provides that flexibility for countries to come and embrace it at a point that where they are in terms of their capacity. Next one, please. Both Henning and Chelsea mentioned sustainable development impact assessments, which can also be used to inform targets as they can be used to inform goals, because they're pointing to potential impacts around which these targets can be designed. So for instance, to mitigate impacts related to employment, related to health, related to gender equity, etc. Targets can be short-term as well as mid to long-term. So just best practice around targets design in general says that it's helpful to not just create shorter term targets, but also mid or longer term targets and have that trajectory in front of you that this is how we move from shorter to mid to long term, and this is the path that we want to take in the longer run. Next, please. So for indicators, once your targets have been set, or if you are, for whatever reason, putting a pause on the step to develop targets, you can start developing your indicators. Indicators help to monitor progress towards your targets if they exist or towards the broader goals. But they are being defined in the context of this particular guidance around just transition. They are being defined to help track changes related to economic, social, and environmental aspects, but with a justice lens. So in that sense, it's different than say the guidance in the Sustainable Development Impact Assessment Guide. For those of you who are familiar with it, that because we are talking about just transition monitoring here, it very consciously brings in this layer of justice, this lens of justice to everything that is being discussed. So as transition policies are being implemented, these indicators are designed in a way that they help you understand how these policies are affecting or are being experienced by communities or households or workers and various economic regions. Next one, please. It is important to note that indicators, as was mentioned earlier too, that they only help monitor the change. If you're looking to establish a cause and effect relationship that is trying to understand what's causing this change, then we recommend that you utilize the guidance that has been provided in other similar guides in the ICAT's toolbox, such as the Sustainable Development Guide that was noted. Next one, please. So change, and this is because changes in indicator value are often influenced by a range of factors. The policy is just one of the factors, and the guide is not, when you're just monitoring the change, you're not really looking at what is underlying that change. Next one, please. So users should really include a combination of indicators pertaining to monitoring economic, social, and environmental changes. Next one, please. And indicators really should be selected so that they are helping one assess the movement towards the targets or goals. So for instance, these could be, next one, please. These could be indicators related to broad changes along social, economic, and environmental dimensions. As you can see in these examples, if you click next, please. So these could be related to employment, related to area of land reforested, related to populations covered under social protection programs. So those broad outcome-oriented changes, which speak to the outcome goals that Chelsea was referring to. Next one, please. Or these could also help monitor underlying enabling indicators that pertain to things like, next one, investments or number of support programs or partnerships that are being signed or being put in place. So these are, as the name suggests, enabling indicators. They potentially contribute to the more outcome-oriented changes in employment, in population coverage by programs, etc. So the two sort of go hand in hand. These provide some early sort of signals of the change that is occurring, and thereby, by the same measure, can also help identify where there may be some challenges and where things may be lacking, and tackling those could help achieve the broader outcome-oriented indicators. These indicators should also be disaggregated by, say, regions, because we are talking about different kinds of justices. So by regions, next one, please, could be if you disaggregate these by regions, such as urban versus rural, or by groups of people, such as by gender or by income, you're getting to the distributive aspect of this justice. And if you look at these changes in terms of how they are, what is the process behind them, how inclusive the transition process is, you are speaking to the procedural justice of part of it. And you can also look at the restorative justice part of it by considering how the transition policies may be designed to prevent future harm, or to redress harm that may have already been done, especially with respect to vulnerable communities or groups. So what the guide provides is this matrix of environmental, economic, social indicators overlaid with these justice dimensions, so that you're not just looking at the changes in those dimensions, but also thinking through how they are being experienced by different groups, and which is where the justice component and not leaving anyone behind component comes in. Next one, please. I will now move to the data collection part of it, and keeping the time in mind, we'll sort of run through it more quickly. Next one. So I mean, GHG emissions monitoring, which perhaps more people are familiar with in general in the climate space itself, can be quite challenging and tedious. And given the number of indicators and the number of dimensions, the justice aspect, the socioeconomic environmental aspect that's included here, this can be even more challenging and tedious process. But what I wanted to emphasize with data collection is that it is important to view this entire exercise as an ongoing process that will continue to improve, will become better over time as experience is gained, as resources become available, as capacity is put in place. So we would urge users to not approach it with this aim to have like a complete perfect system from the very beginning, or to feel like overwhelmed by the number of indicators that may need to be monitored, but to think about what are some of the existing indicators that exist, the accompanying data collection methods that exist, any coordination processes and data sharing processes that already may be in place in the country, especially around, say, the Sustainable Development Goals. A lot of countries are already collecting information around socioeconomic indicators, but it's all housed in different places. So building upon all that information is more important and can make the process more streamlined as well as a little bit more accessible. Next one, please. With the data collected, the next step is to then make sense of this data. And here again, it's a question of capacity and resources, but you can attempt different kinds of analyses, ranging from just a trend analysis to determining baselines, which can then be used to inform the indicators, the targets that, or revising the targets, making them more evidence-based, to tracking progress either historically or into the future towards a long-term target. Next one, please. You can go to the reporting communication component, please, keeping eye on the time here. So next one, skip a few slides. This is all about different kinds of analysis that one can do, and you can see more in the guide. In terms of communication, there are no reporting requirements, as we all know, around just transition. And the emphasis in this chapter is really on thinking through the utility of this information that has been gathered. Next one, please. Who to share it with, what to share and communicate, and how really to use it to communicate with the stakeholders so that it serves the objectives, the benefits of just transition that Chelsea mentioned right in the beginning. So sort of come full circle, think about what objectives you had in mind as you set out to do this exercise, and how the information that's being gathered now could support fulfillment of those objectives. Next one, please. So the guide includes a template to communicate information. This is just meant as a template, a guidance, which has some recommendations regarding two categories to use, to think about as you think of communicating this information to different kinds of possible audience. One is to convey process-related information for transparency purposes. So how things were done, who was involved, how inclusive the process was. The other one is about the more technical information in terms of what you found, the analysis that was done, what are the emerging trends. So tailoring it for various audience groups, which could be domestic audience, but in some cases, perhaps international audience. But there is flexibility in what you pick and choose in terms of what you want to share with the domestic audience versus what you want to share with the international audience here. So next one, please. This, I think, brings us to the end of a quick presentation, just introducing the guide itself. And here is our contact information, and look forward to the discussion session and also hearing reflections from all the country speakers. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Neelam, and also to Chelsea for the presentation and overview of the guide. So I think for me, what has really resonated in this guide's approach is this flexibility. So even though the framework does go step by step, there are these different entry points that allow the guide to be applied by a wide range of countries. So I think we were planning to have some questions now, but I think given the time, it would be good to move on to some of the presentations from the countries. So a really important component of the development of this guide has been these country applications that have gone on in parallel with the guide's development. And these experiences have really shaped and influenced the framework on which the guide is based. And we really wanted to ensure that the framework would be rooted within the realities of countries. So this was a really important point within the development of the guide. So I'm really pleased to now introduce the next three speakers from Nigeria, South Africa, and Brazil to share some of their experiences. And we'll start off with Peter Taffa, who's the Executive Director of the Landmark Center for Environment and Development in Nigeria. So Peter, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much for this opportunity to participate in this insight. Can you hear me? Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
All right. So for us in Nigeria, we took advantage of this guidance basically because in the implementation of the Just and Gender Inclusive Transition MRV framework, we had a technical partnership with the WRI, who are the authors of these guidelines. So they brought it to bear on our experience in Nigeria. And I want to recommend these guidelines to any other country that is really embarking on the development of their just and gender inclusive transition or just transition activity. The one critical thing that every country has to take into account is the implementation structure in country. For us, we had a steering committee, a national steering committee, which basically drew expertise from within government. That has been more providing an oversight and guidance in the implementation so that everything you do tallies with what government policies. In the same vein too, we had very wide stakeholder participation. And apart from the various ministries, departments of agencies, civil society organizations were also there, as well as trade unions. So this was very critical, and we also brought in the media for the purpose of publicizing the outcome of the project in itself. And to give a technical backstopping, we had to engage the international partners through the WRI, while ICAT provided the overall financial support. The guidance has indicated to us that we have to critically outline what is the objective. You have to spell out clearly what are you intending to achieve. For us in Nigeria, we highlighted three key objectives. One, to enhance or to enable cooperation between government, trade unions through the tripartite arrangement, as well as the employer associations. Then secondly, we were targeting that at the end of the project, we would have been able to support policymakers to set up the just and gender inclusive transition framework. So what does that mean? It implies that when we conclude it, government has to own it. And that is what we exactly did. We had to send a memo to the highest approving body, that is the Federal Executive Council. And then now the process is ongoing for taking it to the legislators. So this is also a pathway which countries should embark on. Then, since this is just looking at the just transition, we had to align it with the national activities that was going on at the sectoral. Ours was just a sectoral MRV, and also we have to align it with the enhanced transparency framework that is being developed in the country. So any country that is embarking on its just transition also have to find a way of aligning it basically so that there will be total inclusivity. Because what is the essence of even preparing the just transition itself is to help countries to basically embark on implementations or actions on climate change that has a just approach. Having done that, we now divided our own project into two, that is the scoping. We basically looked at the phase one, which involves an inception workshop, whereby it's an informative stage. So when you're embarking on it, you have to bring a broad stakeholders, inform them, because at the end of the day, you will need data. In one of the guidelines, the pillars of these guidelines that was mentioned was managing the data. How do you generate this data? Who are your data providers? How do you really archive this data that you are getting from them? We did that, and also we went into information gathering. We had to look at what is the existing issues in country at the beginning of the preparation. Who are the stakeholder mapping as a whole? And this is a key thing that needs to be done. After that phase one of the scoping, we went to the phase two, which also aligns with what the guidelines is saying in terms of the design and the analysis. When you gather this data, you need to analyze it. You need to start writing the reports. You need to share it with the stakeholders. You need to get further input from every member of the stakeholders. That we did very well. So the development of the report in itself targeted 2 to 3 sectors. We looked at the oil and gas sector. We looked at the follow sector, and a little insight also on the aspect of agriculture. So you have to identify your key sectors which you will want to undertake or to be the pillars for the project in itself. If a country has the capacity to do a broad one, well, time is of essence, because we started this project in November 2022 and ended it around June 2024. So you can see the scope, and we were just looking at about 2 to 3 sectors. So if you take broad sectors, certainly it will take a longer time. And why were the issues of longer time? Is because of the challenge of data gathering. So this is one of the key challenges which we have to look at it. And our primary aim was to establish a system that transparently tracks just and gender inclusive transition process. Some may not look at gender inclusivity, but ours, we highlighted it. And it will ensure that climate policies and actions are effective, but also equitable and inclusive. This is what the guidelines is highlighting from what the 2 previous speakers have indicated. So we have aligned that with us. I know time is of essence. Let me just conclude by looking at some of the lessons that we learned, that information and data gathering takes much longer than imagined, so it is important to allocate adequate time when you are preparing this project or when you are gathering data. There's also need to allocate time for workshops to educate the stakeholders. because when you go to some trying to gather data from them, it ends up as if you are really educating them. You are creating awareness to them because they don't really understand in total what you are intending to do. And there's also lack of national public and cross-sector workforce climate education and awareness. So these are areas where there's need to look at it very critically as we implement, or as countries embark on implementation of their just transition. So this is the few I want to highlight as our experience in the use of these guidelines, and I recommend it to all other countries. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Peter, for sharing those experiences from Nigeria. And I think highlighting some of the aspects that were really critical to the development of the just and gender inclusive framework in the country. And I think we also really appreciated the challenges and the lessons learned that you shared, which I'm sure will resonate with many of the other countries that are here in this webinar. So just a reminder to everyone in the webinar that if you do have questions, please use the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. We will have some time later on to answer them. So please submit your questions and comments there. So I'd like to hand over now to Yuri Ramkusun, who is the Senior Manager of Monitoring and Evaluation at the Presidential Climate Commission of South Africa, to tell us more about South Africa's experiences. Yuri, over to you.
Thanks so much, Hannah. Are you able to see my screen?
Yes, we can see it.
Okay, wonderful. I just want to say greetings to all, because I know you in various times of the day across the world. And thank you to ICAT, firstly, for the invaluable tool that it's developed, but also for the support that it's given and continues to give to South Africa in our just transition path. I want to speak about practical examples of work that's being done in South Africa, almost as to illustrate the lessons that we've learned along the way. Thanks. To just give you a brief overview of South Africa's background. Like many other African countries, we've been heavily impacted by climate change, including floods, droughts, decreased food security, and energy security. But what's been important and what's really supported us was the consistent progress that the country has made, both in relation to climate action and the just transition. That's with major legal instruments, such as the Constitution, climate change response plans, and recently the President just signed into law our first Climate Change Act. Then we have a just transition framework and just energy transition plans. And I think what's been really, really useful to the country is the unequivocal support that we've received from the President for a just transition and for dealing with climate change or climate change response. So generally, in the face of dissent, we turn to the president and say, well, that's what the president said, that is what our country is saying, and we will stick to that trajectory. The Just Transition Framework was developed in 2022, and it was drafted with South Africa's unique developmental challenges in mind. Like my colleague Peter has spoken about, and also the ICAT tool, we've got a strong commitment to the principles of procedural, restorative, and distributive justice. Procedural justice, we are advisory body, but multi-stakeholder. So on our commissioner's board sits commissioners from all over the country and that represent different constituencies. And generally, all of our meetings are live, and we do a lot of consensus building and engagement with communities. The restorative and distributive justice aspects have been a little more difficult to measure and implement. The Just Transition Framework was developed through broad consensus building, and it's essentially a blueprint for all social partners or stakeholders, and they can use it, accordingly. It assessed the impact of climate change on value chains and also on stakeholder groups. It's important to note that issues like gender, class, and race are sort of mainstreamed across all our work. South Africa is quite unique in that the fault lines of poverty, inequality, unemployment run across fault lines of not just gender, but also race. And then it speaks to improved governance that is required should we embark on given that we're embarking on a just transition, we will need to improve governance within our government. Thanks. What the PCC did after developing the Just Transition Framework was try and develop a monitoring, evaluation, and learning system for the implementation of the framework. And what was envisaged originally was end goal, and then we tried to work backwards, noting what the outcome was, try and work backwards, and that was just using a theory of change. The set of outcomes or sort of assumptions we made were that we need decarbonization at an affordable pace and scale, that any just transition must be people-centered, it must build in adaptive measures, and that it must be just. And when we say just, we refer back to the three aspects of justice that I spoke about. So we developed a list of indicators in consultation with stakeholders, but we did find that the indicators have very limited applicability. So even though there were indicators that had information linked to them, or we developed indicators where we knew we could get information and it was accessible, we found that the indicators only told one side of the story, and it wasn't adequate for measuring a just transition, and it wasn't adequate for course correction or learning lessons. But it did provide a grounded base of theory and principles for the just transition moving forward. So it's essentially one tool, I think, in an arsenal of tools that we have. Another way in which we have monitored the just transition in South Africa is through stakeholder engagements. And this again links to procedural justice and also learning networks. Stakeholder engagements has been, here it says valuable to it, but it's invaluable in data collection that feeds into our M&E system. This includes information from communities, both urban and rural, broad stakeholder groups, civil society groups, faith-based organizations, and so forth. And it takes many forms. It depends on the type of stakeholder. So if we're doing, state departments, they may be one-on-one small meetings. Community engagements may be larger, and it's often focused on consensus building and transparent and accessible and inclusive. And collaborate, sorry, I need to move this. We collaborate with and assess what other groups are doing, and we aim to share the lessons we learn to maximize resources, which includes financial, human, and more. And we do this locally or domestically, but recently we've also expanded the learning to an international community of practice where we had participants from all over the world, particularly Africa, South America, Asia. And it was such an amazing experience to see what challenges other countries are facing, the ones that we had in common, the ones that were different, and what we could learn from them. Rapid evaluation exercises are also a very useful tool for our monitoring and evaluation process. It tells you almost a story that's happening on the ground. They're very ad hoc, and the aim is to provide rapid results and findings and possibly recommendations. So an example of these we have a cold belt, an area that's referred to as the cold belt on the east of South Africa in Mpumalanga, where there's many coal-fired power stations that will be decommissioned in the coming years. So the first one to be decommissioned was the Komati Power Station. This wasn't for our mitigation targets, but it had reached the end of its lifespan. So the president asked the PCC to go and monitor the decommissioning process and to essentially learn lessons from that process. And we did that. And some of the findings are listed here. But what was important about this study was that the lessons we learned, we hope to actually replicate at other decommissioning plants in the future. And we've subsequently developed monthly coordination meetings dealing with the decommissioning at Komati. And we have work streams to ensure that the community surrounding that power station are actually given the support that they require. And then floods in eThekwini, this is an ongoing study, but almost at its end, where in 2022, the city of Durban on the southeast coast of South Africa had terrible floods, and they've had a few subsequent to that. And we're looking at the recommendations that were provided by both national and international organizations to try and assess which of those recommendations had been implemented, what's changed, and if future floods do happen, and they will, how the city would respond. And again, that will hopefully be replicated to other cities who experience similar impacts. We also have I spoke about the coordination forum and work streams for Komati. The broader research we've done in this country to feed into our MELD system is the State of Climate Action Report. It's essentially an assessment of progress towards multiple indicators of change, including mitigation, adaptation, and sectoral indicators. We interviewed experts, studied the environment in which climate policy is made, and importantly, conducted the first nationally representative survey on perceptions of climate change and the just transition. And the key finding was, although South Africa has strong commitments towards a just transition, progress is not happening at the pace and scale required. And those were some of the findings that we presented. But this was a very broad type of monitoring and evaluation exercise. And the rapid studies, I think, are deeper dives into these. This is the nationally representative study that we did, statistically representative. I won't go through the findings. You can see what they say here. But essentially, it was the first of its kind. It will be replicated, I think, biannually. It was with over 3,000 respondents in the country. And it will just help us to understand where policy efforts and implementation efforts need to be directed. And it won't just be for us, importantly, it will be for the state and environmental civil society organizations and different spheres of government as well. And then we have Voices of the Transition. This is a project designed to add sort of a qualitative or human aspect to our work. So the PCC contracted a storyteller to visit communities across the country to interview people that are affected by the just transition, or in some cases, just climate change. And what's important about this is the stories not just highlight the plight of communities that are or will be impacted by the transition, but also interlinkages between the just transition and other socioeconomic indicators such as poverty and access to other rights like healthcare and basic education. We see very clearly a very gendered impact of the just transition, also race, the implications for different races. So it really is a deep dive into the lives of people where we ordinarily, people slip through the gaps and we miss information. And importantly, we found in all of these stories that communities acknowledge the need for the closure of coal mines, which we wouldn't have expected because they know firsthand what the impacts of coal has had on their health and well-being. But they were obviously coal dependent, so they were concerned about their future, without coal. And then finally, one of our major projects is aiming to embed the just transition into the work of government. So the PCC worked with our National Department of Planning, Monitoring and Evaluation to mainstream the just transition into government development plans, but also into the strategic plans, which are more long-term plans for government departments, and then annual performance plans of government departments. Our initial review of these plans showed a woeful underrepresentation of just transition and even climate-related outcomes in the work of government, even in the environmental and mining departments. So a lot of work will be done in the coming years to try and embed the just transition, and I think ICAT is going to be supporting the work here as well. And this is just, some of the lessons we learned and we need to work on moving forward. We need to refine our indicator list to make it work better and less onerous. Continue with the rapid assessments, but then make sure they feed back into the MELD system to ensure course correction or implementation of recommendations. Continue with the work on building communities of practice because they are invaluable sources of information. Continue working with the state to embed the just transition into that work. And then the State of Climate Action Report will also be replicated every 2 years. And, we can see changes in results over time, but importantly, continuous engagements, not just with other organizations, but with communities, civil society organizations, and so forth, to ensure that we are transparent, accessible, there's access to information, and we keep, the basic principles under which we operate. Thank you so much.
Great, thanks, Yuri, for sharing the context of what's going on in South Africa. And I can appreciate there's many different facets of the work that's going on as well. So I'd like to introduce the final speaker for today, who is Ana Paula Cunha Machado Cavalcante. And she's the Director of the Department of Climate Governance and Articulation at the Ministry of Environment and Climate Change in Brazil. So Ana Paula, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Hannah, and thank you all of you for inviting me to participate in this webinar, and also for the partnership that we are having with ICAT. It has been extremely important for the development of our national strategy for just transition. So thank you very much for all the work. It is a working process, as it was said in the beginning of the presentation, and this partnership and all the material, this material that you have produced helped us a lot to move from the idea of just transition to concrete actions and how to actually implement it. So it's a very important webinar, and I'm really glad to be here. So I will share a few slides. Let me know if you can see my screen, please.
Yes, we can see, but it's not in presentation mode.
What about
yes,
now?
Now
Can
it
you
is.
see it?
Yes.
Okay.
Perfect.
So thank you very much. So as you already know, Brazil has presented its NDC during the last COP. It is a quite ambitious one. So now our challenge is to move from compromises and targets to implementation and action. And for that, we have the so-called Brazilian Climate Plan, which is our our strategy, our work plan to implement the compromises that were established in our NDCs. So just a brief presentation on how this climate plan is structured here in Brazil. It is a work in process, and we are planning to finish it by October this year. With the approval of the president and before COP30 in Brazil. So we are working a lot on it. So our strategic planning for implementing the NDC, the Brazilian Climate Plan, is divided in the National Mitigation Strategy and the National Adaptation Strategy. And we also have 7 mitigation sectoral plans and 16 adaptation sectoral plans. Besides these both areas, we are developing what we are calling the transversal strategies for climate action, which compromises issues that are important to adaptation and to mitigation action. So one of them, and that's the one that we are working quite closely with ICAT and WREI, is the Just Transition Transversal Strategy. I'll speak more about it later soon. And the other one is the social impact, environmental, social, economic, and environmental impacts of the transition, which is a more economic and data document. So we will look into modeling and seeing some numbers about possible impacts. The third one is means of implementation, which we all know it's extremely important. We need to have the set of policies, but also means to implement them. So finance, technology, capacity building, and so on. But we have one specific on capacity building in education, innovation, and technological development, because we think it is extremely important to develop a climate strategy for enhancing climate and environmental education and capacity building in Brazil. And the final one, which is also closely related to what we are discussing today, is the monitoring, management, evaluation, and transparency strategy. This one will guarantee that we won't have just a book with a set of words on the minister's table. We will have actually a work plan, a system for monitoring the targets and the indicators, and to evaluate the Brazilian progress to achieve its goals. So just to speak a little bit more on how are we developing those plans, and specifically how we are introducing just transition into our strategy. I think I have moved this one. Okay. So the transversal just transition strategy is looking at each of these sectoral plans to see how the basket of measures, the set of policies that is established in each of them will impact different dimensions of just transition. So each of these mitigation and adaptation plans, they have a set of goals, a set of measures and policies, and also indicators to monitor if they are assessing those targets or not. And those indicators, they are of 2 main types. We have the enabling indicators, that measures that will help us to get there. So finance, capacity building, institutional strengthening, and so on. And we have the impact indicators. Regarding the impact indicators, for mitigation, for instance, we will measure CO2 emissions reduction. So are those measures helping us to actually reduce CO2 emissions? But we will also measure the impacts of those set of measures on different dimensions of just transitions. That the ones that we are working more closely are quality jobs, biodiversity, poverty, gender, and race inequality. So these indicators will look how those set of policies are impacting each of these dimensions. It's not an easy task. We have a group of people working on that. I'm sure it is and it will be a work in progress. What we will do is to try to look to the policies that have higher impact on and are most important on our NDCs, and try to monitor those that will have a higher probability and higher impact, and the magnitude of the impact is bigger, to choose the priorities for monitoring. So we also we within the monitoring strategies, we are also developing it right now. I could have brought some ideas, but speaking broadly, we will work with those indicators. We have a group, a set of people that will be responsible for collecting data in 23 ministers. So the ministers that are responsible for each of those sectoral plans, they will have focal points responsible for gathering the necessary data, and they will provide the data to a group responsible for gathering the data and producing the reports, and we have a process for evaluating those reports, and it's being developed, and I think it's the key, the heart of the Brazilian working plan, because we need targets, we need strategy to reach those targets, and we need a governing system to follow up on that. So regarding just transition, we are now in the moment of developing the goals, priorities, and indicators. Next year, we will start the data gathering processes and all the analysis and the reports. And we are looking at different dimensions: economic impacts, social impacts, and also environmental impacts, as I mentioned, gender and race inequalities, impacts on traditional and indigenous communities. It's also very important. Biodiversity is a dimension that's also very important to Brazil. So speaking a little bit about, we have been studying the ICAT material, so we are looking on these three kinds of justice: the distributive. We need to make sure that who is winning and who is losing in this process of transitioning to a low carbon economy, and we need to have a clear information on that and strategies to how to address that. Processual justice is extremely relevant, and I will speak a little bit about it, because it is important not just to give legitimacy to the final policies, but also to engage the necessary stakeholders for its implementation. So we cannot develop it within the environmental and climate change minister. We need to engage all the sectoral ministers. We need to engage the private sector and civil society and workers, because all of them will be necessary to implement those measures. And restorative justice is extremely important to Brazil. As you know, inequalities is a huge problem in our country, and fighting poverty, hunger, and inequality is a very important goal for us. We cannot allow that this transition for a new economy, a low carbon economy, it cannot deepen the inequalities that exist, and we need policies to restore justice and guarantee further equality. So speaking a little bit about governance, how are we organizing ourselves to provide an inclusive governing process on developing the Brazilian climate plan? We have a committee called the Brazilian Interministerial Committee for Climate Change. It gathers 23 ministers, and they get together twice a year to make the main decisions regarding the Brazilian policy. But we also have an executive subcommittee that it's at the sub-ministerial level, so Secretary of States, It's 11 of them, the most relevant areas. They get together much more often, every month, I would say, or at least every 2 months. And those are responsible for really moving forward with the Brazilian climate plan. We also have at the technical level the working groups. So there is a strong working group gathering technical people from different ministries and also from the academy, universities, and civil society to actually develop the documents. So they are responsible for creating all these documentations and discussing the strategies that will further be submitted to the executive subcommittee and then to the ministers' plenary. So we also have a working group for adaptation. We have a working group that is developing the Brazilian carbon market, domestic ETS. We have now 4 working groups working on the transversal strategies for the climate plan, including one that is working on the just transition strategy. And we have created recently, we are setting 3 participatory chambers. We have one responsible for articulation with subnational authorities, so states and municipalities. Brazil is a huge country. We must have a specific place for coordinate policies in multiple levels, because we know that to implement all those measures, we will need subnational authorities. We are establishing a social participation chamber that will gather representatives from the private sector and civil society and workers, and they will also participate in the elaboration and mainly monitoring the implementation of the Brazilian climate plan. And we have also just created, we will have the first meeting, and we're very proud of it, the Scientific Advisory Chamber that unites the main scientists in Brazil, not only on climate science, but also on economics and just transition and public policies, different kinds of knowledges that are relevant to advise the Brazilian governments on how to implement and evaluate and revise its climate plan. So that's the governance framework that we have established. And just to finish, why it is so relevant to monitor just transition in our view. We won't be able to deal with everything, but public policy managers and decision makers, they must have a clear risk assessment matrix. They need to know what are the possible impacts of the public policies that they are elaborating, and that will give them the opportunity to plan to avoid those adverse effects, so we can make sure that these new policies won't worsen the inequalities that we already have, and will be able to actually promote sustainable and inclusive growth in our country. So it is a very challenging job, but a very important one. And thank you so much for the partnership and all the work that you have done that is helping us a lot with this process. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ana Paula. And again, I think it's really interesting to see how Just Transitions monitoring is being done in another country context, and how the guide is being applied within Brazil. And I really like what you said about using the guide to move from ideation to action, using it as a way to get started. So thank you very much. So in the interest of time, I think we will need to skip the final Q&A. We have noted all of your questions, and we'll make sure that we send answers via email. Also to note that this webinar is being recorded, so we will share a recording with you as well. So I'd like to hand over to Henning now for some very quick concluding remarks. Over to you, Henning.
Thank you very much, Hannah, and many thanks to all the presenters, to Peter Tafer, Yuri, and Ana Paula for excellent presentations, to our team at WI, Chelsea and Neelam, and of course the whole team at WI who have been so engaged and working extremely hard to develop the guide. Many thanks to you, Hannah, and also all colleagues here at the ICAT Secretariat for the work done to make this possible. So I think you all have seen that we have a very rich guide with a lot of material that allows to get started. And we have seen the flexibility that the guide offers to apply this to very different contexts. And just transition clearly means something very different from country to country. And so I want to end this webinar by encouraging you to get started. You have seen that how countries have been able to move this work forward, and they all started with an empty sheet and then developed the governance framework, collected the data, used the data as not only as a challenge, but actually as an opportunity to move things forward, and turned also this into an investment opportunity, which I think we've seen highlighted by several of the country examples that we've heard from, even though most of them are not quite there yet. But I think this is all part of a process, and I've seen also in the Q&A reference that this comes at a very important time as countries are building their next update to the NDC 3.0. So again, please take this as inspiration and encouragement to get started. Use the support that we can offer. And then, of course, we all look forward to coming with strong NDCs and strong NDC updates to Belen, to COP30, where we can then hopefully celebrate a good step forward in this extremely important journey. And clearly, it's not something that can be done overnight, but when you get started, you will see that progress is feasible. So thank you all for participating. Thanks again to the speakers, and do stay in touch. Let us know if you have any questions or comments. Even though we haven't been able to do the discussion here, we are available online to respond to any questions that you may have. Thank you very much.
Great, thank you, Henning. So I'll just reiterate my thanks to all the speakers. Thank you all, to everyone who has stayed with us to the end of the webinar. So have a lovely morning, afternoon, evening, and we'll end the webinar now. Thank you and goodbye.